So, tariffs. I really don't know what else to say about the last few weeks. This has been an unbelievably tough week for a lot of my friends and people I know in the ecom and CPG space. And before I go any further with this video and discussion about tariffs, I just want to say I'm sorry. Sorry for what you're going through. And I know that this is not easy. Now, listen, I am not here to pretend to be an international trade expert. I am also not an expert on tariffs. But one thing I do know quite a lot about is finance and e-commerce and financial math of basically how these businesses work and how they do and don't make money. So what I'm going to be focusing on this video is providing you guys with the tools and framework and bits and pieces that you need to basically help you think through this. I want to do as much as I can to help get your head around it. What I have in this video is some really cool data, some free tools and spreadsheets that you're going to be able to download, and also some thoughts and ideas about the different paths forwards here. I'm not expert enough to be able to tell you definitively what to do, but I did want to outline some of the broad parameters as I see them and at least get you kind of thinking in the right direction in terms of how you might deal with this. Okay, so first of all, we need to understand the numbers. And in order to do that, I've actually been lucky enough to partner with the kind folks at Finaloop recently. If you haven't heard of it, Finaloop they're not a sponsor of this video or anything. I am not being paid a cent by them to say this, but they're basically a bookkeeping and accounting platform that specializes in e-commerce businesses. These guys have got thousands and thousands of businesses on the platform, and that means that they have a huge amount of data on early stage e-commerce businesses and their profitability. Now, what the guys over at Finaloop have been kind enough to share with me is basically this data set here, which breaks down by quarter and by sub-industry the net sales margin, the gross margin, the contribution margin, and the EBITDA. And what it means, what we can deduce from this is we can figure out the COGS, we can figure out the customer acquisition or advertising cost for each of these subsectors, and we can also infer from this what the overheads and indirect costs are for each of these different types of businesses. Now, I am not going to go through each of these sectors or industries separately, but what I am going to be using in this video is the aggregated numbers down the bottom here. So this is essentially an average of all sectors. We're talking about here average numbers for over 1,000 companies. And what I'm doing is just taking the 2024 totals here. So essentially what we can do with these numbers is understand what a generic e-commerce business looks like in the United States in 2024. And I thought a good way to kind of map this out as a starting point is on this piece of paper. So to begin with, what this data from Finaloop is telling us is that for a theoretical company where we had, say, $100 of net revenue, these businesses have on average about $15 worth of discounts, refunds, and I think there might be some freight related adjustments in here as well. And what that means is that they start with $115 of gross revenue. So what you as a consumer would be buying online is a $115 product, but then there's some discounts, refunds, some shipping adjustments, blah, blah. And the company is essentially netting $100, okay? After that, these businesses will have on average about $48 worth of COGS. So you can see that here. That gets us down to a GP or gross profit of about $52. These businesses are paying on average $23 for their CAC or customer acquisition cost. That's kind of the marketing spend here, which gives us a gross margin of $29 or 29% in this example. The overheads on these businesses are averaging about $20. So there's our 20. And that 20 for overheads is stuff like staff, legal, accounting, subscriptions, and that sort of stuff, which means that what we're left with is about $9 of EBITDA. Now that EBITDA is not actually the end of the story. We may have depreciation charges. There's quite likely also some interest charges, maybe tax charges as well. But that's as far as I'm going to go for now, okay? So we're starting at gross revenue, going to EBITDA, and this is essentially what an e-commerce business in the US looks like in the year 2024, okay? Now, the question at hand here, and what everyone is trying to figure out, is what the heck is going on with these tariffs and how is it going to impact this entire industry? Now, the impact of these tariffs is primarily going to be impacted or felt here, which is the cost of goods sold. Now, the tariffs are only going to apply to the imported products, obviously. So if you have a supply chain and if you're sourcing some materials domestically, that wouldn't be subject to tariffs. But you do need to be thinking about not just whether or not you have a US distributor or whether or not the person that you're purchasing from is located in the US, but you actually need to understand where they're purchasing from. And it's not uncommon for suppliers of things like, packaging and various ingredients to be sourcing internationally. They have domestic warehouses. So you might be dealing with a US company when you buy some of these materials, but it is quite likely that the supply chain extends internationally, and therefore it could be subject to tariffs. The other thing you want to keep in mind is, as far as I understand, the tariffs are not going to apply to things like the shipping charges, handling charges in the port, domestic freight costs to get this stuff into your warehouse, right? They would not be subject to tariff. So unlikely that 100% of your cost of goods sold will actually have tariffs applied to them. So less than 100% would be my expectation in terms of how the tariffs hit there. But then you've obviously got to think about, okay, what is the actual tariffs going to be? Like I said, I'm not a tariff expert. Even if I was, I would not be talking about specific numbers in this video because frankly, it seems like they're changing every single day. But as a hypothetical example, if we had a business that was entirely Chinese costs, and if we took the current number for China tariffs, which I understand to be about 84%, so we've got 84% being applied to this number here. What that means is that the 48 would become 88. Now, the question that everyone is thinking about and trying to understand is what happens with that extra $40 that we've just added into cost structure there. It is clearly not viable for the brands to carry that cost, because if you pushed $40 through this P&L or through this cost structure, you're going to completely wipe out that $9 there, okay? $40 of extra cost takes that 9 and makes it negative 31. And clearly no brand is going to want to or be able to operate in that sort of environment. So the topic on everyone's minds and what we in the CPG and e-commerce industry are trying to understand is, firstly, what is that number going to be? And where's it going to go? Like, what else needs to move around on this diagram in order to accommodate that $40? And that's precisely what I wanted to dive into next. So what we're going to do is switch over to this little spreadsheet that I've put together for you that basically outlines a bunch of different scenarios. So the first scenario here is essentially exactly the same as what I just drew on the paper. So what you're seeing here is all of the numbers from the sheet of paper. Now, the first adjustment that we could be thinking about here and hypothetically making is adjusting the cost of goods sold. And as I said, one example or scenario we could consider is that the COGS goes up by 84%. Now, if the COGS goes up by 84%, that means that we go from $48 to $88 COGS. And if there were no adjustment to pricing, in other words, all this stuff stayed the same, this is what the rest of the P&L is going to look like. As I said, it would drive a pretty significant loss. Now, just to visualize that for you, it means we're going from this to this. Okay, things look pretty ugly. Now, we've already talked about why that's not, viable long term. So let's think about some alternative situations here, right? Now, the first one could be that the brand attempts to implement price increases in order to protect their margin. So what I'm doing in the second scenario here is basically saying, I want to keep all the stuff constant. So you'll see we've still got $9 of EBITDA, we've still got $30 of contribution contribution margin, and we still got $52 of gross margin, the same as what we began with. Now, if we wanted to maintain that profitability and we needed to accommodate an $88 cost of goods sold, what that's going to mean is that our price, I should say net revenue, would need to increase to $140. Now, I don't know exactly what's going to happen with the refunds and discounts, but if we kept them the same in dollar terms, it would mean that our gross revenue, which is basically the price that a consumer is going to pay when they go to buy this product online, goes to $155. In other words, we have a 35% price increase to the consumer if this brand was to maintain its profitability and do the same as it was generating before in dollar terms. Okay, so just to show you what that looks like, we'd go from this scenario here where basically the brand is carrying the full burden of the tariffs to this scenario here. Like I said, we've maintained the margins, and instead of pushing the cost down through the P&L, we're essentially pushing the cost up through the P&L instead. Now, the final scenario that I think is worth talking about here and thinking about is what happens to customer acquisition costs, right? For most products and most industries, there's a correlation between price and customer acquisition costs. That is to say, when you're asking a customer to pay more for a product, it's probably reasonable to assume that you're going to need to pay more to acquire that customer. Now, what I've done in order to kind of think through that is a final scenario here over on the right hand side. And in this scenario, I've kept the EBITDA margin, I've kept the contribution margin, I've increased the customer acquisition cost by 50%. So we're going from $22 to $34. What that means is that we need a higher gross margin. The gross margin would in fact need to be 22% higher. I'm saying that the COGS is unchanged. That's the same as before. But what we can then do is recalculate another revenue figure. And so we're getting to 151 here. Once you apply the refunds, discounts, and shipping, you get to $166. That is a gigantic cost increase compared to the 115 we're operating at just, a week or so ago. Now, I would anticipate that something you're probably going to see a lot of brands do is pull back on a lot of the discounting they're doing. I just don't think they're going to be able to afford it. So when we're looking at the Littlewood data for 2025, I would anticipate that we're probably going to see a much lower number here in terms of the discounts and refund line, which will probably have an impact on gross revenue as well. And just to put that into context for you, we're now talking about a scenario that looks like this. So anyway, like I said, I wanted to just outline the math here and kind of show you guys how all these numbers fit together. If you're keen to grab a copy of this spreadsheet, I'm going to include a link to it below. Knock your socks off. I hope it's helpful. Now, what I wanted to talk about next is some of the more strategic considerations that are in front of us here and where we really go in terms of how do you respond to all this. Before I dive into that, I do think it's important for us to understand a thing or two about economics. And for any of you that have taken an economics class ever in your life, then you're probably familiar with a concept called the supply and demand curve. And for those of you who haven't, it works a little bit like this. Basically, what you're looking at here is volume of production or supply in a market. So this is the number of widgets or phone cases or t-shirts that are being sold. And then we've got price on the y-axis. Now, in most markets, what you have is, I should say in all markets, you have basically two different curves. One is going to be what we call the demand curve, that looks a little bit like this, and I'm going to label that D1. And what the demand curve is essentially saying to us is that if we had a really, really high price, then there's only a small number of people that are going to be willing to pay that for that product, because for a lot of people, this is too expensive. But if you were to lower the price, then what happens is you get more and more people willing to buy. And so we'd move from here over here. And essentially the demand curve is an attempt to summarize what that relationship looks like. I've shown it linearly here, but it doesn't need to be linear. This could be curved, and it can also sit at, different different angles. But that's the demand curve. The other important part of this graph is the supply curve. And I'm going to call this S1 for now. Now, the supply curve basically tells us how we're going to meet the other side of the market. We've got demand, now we need supply. And what the supply curve tells us is that as price for a product increases, there's probably going to be more and more people who are willing to produce it, right? If I told you that you can make $2 manufacturing a t-shirt, you'd probably go, meh, I'm not interested. There might be a few people out there who are, but the volume's not going to be very high. Now, if we came back and said, all right, the price of a t-shirt's now $2,000, you'll probably be interested in manufacturing that t-shirt. And so the volume of supply increases as price does. Now, the most important point on this entire chart is this point here, which is what we call the equilibrium point. This is where the supply curve and the demand curve overlap, and we achieve what we call equilibrium. So this is V1, this is E1, and I'm going to call this P1 for price one. So this is a point at which this market is in balance. Now, what's happening as a result of the tariffs is obviously the cost of production is going up. And when the cost of production goes up, the price of that production also needs to go up if we want to offer the same incentive for people to produce and supply. So what has essentially happened as a result of these tariffs is we've moved the supply curve up. So we now have a situation where we've got S2. And as you can see, S2 is higher than S1 at every point along the x-axis here. Interestingly, we also have a new equilibrium point. You'll notice that the equilibrium point, which we'll call E2, has moved up and to the left. So what this is telling us is that we can still satisfy demand here, but it's going to have to go to people who are willing to pay a higher price. So we now have a situation where the price of this product is higher, and the other change here is that the volume is lower. So we're selling less, but at a higher price than before. Now, if you wanted to take this a step further, you could also say that, well, is the US consumer that healthy at the moment? And are they really feeling as confident and wanting to spend as much money as they normally would? I would argue that with all of the job losses going on, concerns about the economy, inflation, blah, 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 that there's probably a good argument to say that people are actually going to be reducing their willingness to pay. And so, a product that someone was willing to pay $100 for a year ago, they may not be willing to pay that $100 anymore. Their willingness to pay might have actually reduced. So what happens is that the demand curve, and we may have very well experienced a scenario where the demand curve has actually shifted, and we've now got D2. Now, going back to our equilibrium concept, we're now over here. We're at E3. So we went from E1 to E2, and then E2 to E3. And we've now got P3 and, importantly, V3. And so the question that is on everyone's mind right now is, what's going on with this? Where is all of this volume change coming from? Who are these suppliers and brands and manufacturers going to be? It seems almost certain that we need to have some sort of contraction in volume here. And what we're all trying to figure out is who that's going to be and where it's going to come from. So with all of this in mind, let's talk about the possible paths forward here. And in order to do that, we need to appreciate that there's really two different types of businesses. So when it comes to thinking through and figuring out what we should do about all of this, we need to first understand how your business is likely to be impacted by these tariffs. For some, it's obviously a huge problem, and you're going to be worse off as a result of the tariffs. There are, however, businesses that are actually beneficiaries of this, and they're likely to be advantaged because of the tariffs. Now, clearly, the people who are worse off will be porters, and they're looking at higher costs. The people who are beneficiaries would be businesses that are producing domestically, or they have a domestically focused supply chain, but they're competing with other companies that are using a lot of imports. And what's going to happen is that all of their competitors will have cost increases. So all of their competitors are going to be trying to put prices up. And if you're a domestic supplier, you don't really have any change in your cost structure. So that potentially represents a margin expansion opportunity. Some of the other things that you could potentially anticipate if you were, likely to be a winner from this, and you did have a domestic supply chain with low tariff risk, is that you could anticipate that some of your competitors are going to be disappearing from the market, either permanently or temporarily. You might also anticipate that some of your international competitors are going to be coming and looking at your supply chain. That's right. Your competitors are probably going to be calling up your 3PLs, your co-packers, and your other suppliers and going, hey, can I get in on the action? I can't afford to import from China or Vietnam anymore. How about you make that product for me too, Mr. Michigan or wherever you're located? So this is a really good time for you to be trying to strengthen your relationships with these suppliers. You want to really, really get close to your supply chain partners, particularly if they're, domestically focused, and they're going to be getting more and more attention and probably more and more phone calls. As that happens and your domestic suppliers become in more demand, then you might also expect that they're probably going to raise their prices too. So if there's a way that you could give yourself some sort of contractual security here, that could be a really interesting thing to do. You might also want to talk to your supply chain partners about what it would look like if we do have some competitors leave the market. How are we going to ramp up our own production? Do we have enough supply and capacity to be able to produce an extra 10, 50, 100% more if some of our internationally focused competitors end up disappearing, right? How are we going to respond to that? On the flip side, if you're in the unfortunate situation of being adversely impacted by these tariffs, I guess number one is I would say don't do anything too dramatic. I'm recording this video, what is it? I think it's the 8th or 9th of April today. We're only a week into this now. Things are still changing very, very rapidly. Rather than, shoot from the hip and immediately reconfigure your entire business, what I would recommend you focus on now is optionality, and just try to build out and understand and map out as many options as you can. Options are what give you choices, and choices give you power. So you need to try to get as many of these, options as you're possibly able to. Anyway, guys, that's a wrap for this video. Those of you who are still living and breathing this every day, my heart goes out to you. Hang in there. I'm sure you'll find a way, and you make your way through it. If there's anything that I can potentially do to help you, you got free reign in the comment section below. I read and will respond to any and all comments that you leave there. If you would like a copy of the spreadsheet that I was showing earlier, feel free to grab a copy of that below. And if you're looking for some help understanding your finances and numbers more broadly for your e-commerce business, feel free to hit me up. Anyway, guys, it's been a pleasure. Hang in there, and I'll see you next time. Bye.